Decision making, it's everywhere, right? Every single day you're making choices. I mean, whether it's deciding what to tackle first at work or maybe how your team will approach a project or even, how a whole organization responds to a crisis. It feels so fundamental, sometimes incredibly complex, and honestly, often a little messy.
It really is. It's sort of the engine driving everything we do, isn't it? From like the smallest personal choice right up to the most complex government policy.
Mhm.
Understanding the process, how and why decisions get made or sometimes not made well, that offers incredible insight.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've been
Mhm.
spending time with a really fascinating text. It's quite a comprehensive guide that really digs into the models, the techniques, the best practices behind, well, strategic decision making.
Yeah, and our goal here is really to unpack this material for you, pulling out the most important insights. We'll look at the classic steps involved, explore a whole toolbox of different techniques you can use depending on the situation,
Right.
and dive into various theories that try to explain why decisions actually play out the way they do in, well, the real world.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Right at the beginning, the source text gives us a core definition. What is decision making at its heart?
Well, at its simplest, the guide defines it as basically choosing a course of action to achieve a specific goal. It emphasizes just how critical this is, whether you're talking about high-level strategy or daily operations or adapting to change. Every intentional action really starts with a choice.
So it's not just randomly picking something. It's a deliberate process focused on an outcome. And the text really grounds this in a foundational model, doesn't it? Herbert Simon's stages.
Yes, absolutely. Simon's work is presented as completely central, and while sometimes it gets simplified, the source really details his four key stages, and it highlights the often overlooked fourth one, feedback or evaluation.
Okay, walk us through those. What's the first stage Simon identified?
It starts with intelligence. Now, think of this as scanning your environment, collecting data, gathering information. It's all about figuring out what's going on, identifying problems that need solving, or maybe opportunities you could pursue. It's really the raw material phase.
Got it. Gathering the facts, what comes after you know what's happening?
Then comes design. This is where, based on the information you've gathered, you start developing possible alternatives, solutions maybe. You brainstorm ideas, create models, perhaps even run simulations to see how different options might play out. It's sort of the creative part, generating possibilities.
Okay, so you've got the problem or opportunity, you've generated some ideas. Now you have to pick one, right? Is that the choice stage?
Precisely. You analyze the alternatives you designed and select the best one. But, and this is really important, this is where the source, leaning heavily on Simon's work,
Yeah.
introduces an absolutely crucial concept, bounded rationality.
Founded rationality.
Okay.
Okay, that's the idea that we're not perfect supercomputers, right? We have limits.
Exactly. Simon pointed out that humans, well, we don't have unlimited information or infinite processing power. We operate within cognitive limits. So when we reach the choice stage, we're often not selecting the theoretically optimal option, the absolute perfect one,
Right.
but rather the one that is satisfactory or good enough given our constraints.
Satisficing, that's such a great term for it. Feels much more realistic. We aim to satisfy, not necessarily optimize every single time.
Right. It's really a cornerstone of understanding real-world decision-making.
Yeah.
And the fourth stage.
Feedback or evaluation, you mentioned that.
Yes. This happens after you've implemented your chosen course of action. You monitor the outcomes, you compare them to what you expected, and critically, you feed those insights back into the intelligence stage. It closes the loop, making it a cycle of continuous learning.
So it's not just a one-and-done process. It's meant to be iterative. Okay, let's use that example from the source, the one about a marketing team launching a new product. How would Simon's stages apply there?
Yeah, it maps out pretty nicely. The marketing team starts with intelligence, digging into market research, maybe running customer surveys, analyzing competitors. They're gathering all the facts about the landscape.
Then they design.
Exactly. Based on that research, they'll design various campaign options.
Right.
Maybe it's a viral social media strategy, influencer collaborations, specific promotions, different ad creatives, all sorts of possibilities.
That comes a choice.
Well, then they analyze those campaign options. They're looking at projected return on investment, budget feasibility, how well each aligns with the brand and the target audience. They select the campaign that seems most viable and aligns with their goals. That's the satisfying choice, really, within their resources.
And finally, they need that feedback. Can't forget that.
They absolutely do. After launch, they've got to rigorously track sales data, Website traffic, social media engagement, customer feedback. That monitoring is the feedback loop. They use that information to refine the current campaign or, crucially, inform how they approach the next product launch. It feeds right back into their intelligence gathering for future decisions.
That makes Simon's model really concrete. And that idea of bounded rationality and satisficing is so key. It immediately tells us, we need to be realistic about what we can actually achieve when making choices.
It definitely reframes the idea of what a good decision even is.
So we've defined decision-making, got the steps involved. Now let's think about who is actually doing the deciding. The source talks about two main approaches based on participation, right?
Right. Individual and group decision-making. Pretty straightforward discussion.
Individual decision-making, one person makes the call. When does the source suggest this is usually the way to go?
It's often preferred when time is really limited, or the scope of the decision is relatively narrow. You need a quick decision, or it only impacts one or two areas significantly.
What's the big win with that approach? The main advantage?
Speed, definitely. And clear accountability. You know exactly who made the call, for better or for worse.
Makes sense. And the downside? What's the risk?
Well, you might miss out on diverse perspectives, right? And it's definitely more prone to the individual decision maker's own biases or, their blind spots.
That makes total sense. The example the source gives is a manager approving an urgent purchase order. You need that speed, and one person can own that decision. Straightforward.
Exactly. Compare that to group decision making, which obviously involves multiple participants.
When is that approach better suited?
This approach is generally better for complex issues. Things that really benefit from drawing on multiple areas of expertise or different perspectives. When the problem touches different parts of an organization or just requires varied knowledge to even understand it fully.
Okay, so what are the upsides of bringing a group together?
Well, you typically get a wider range of ideas, often a better information base, because multiple people are contributing their knowledge. And there tends to be a stronger sense of collective ownership of the decision once it's made, which helps with implementation.
More heads are better than one, potentially. But I imagine there are challenges too. Group dynamics can be tricky.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost always more time-consuming. There's the risk of groupthink, which is a big one, where people suppress their own doubts just to conform to the perceived group consensus. And simply reaching consensus with multiple opinions can be really difficult.
The challenge of getting everyone on the same page, yeah. The source's example here is a cross-functional product development team deciding on future priorities. That fits perfectly. You need input from engineering, marketing, sales, support. Everyone has a piece of the puzzle.
It requires navigating those different viewpoints, sometimes competing viewpoints, to land on a decision that works broadly for everyone involved.
Okay, so we know what it is, the basic steps, and who might be involved, individual or group. That brings us to the how. The source presents a whole toolbox of techniques, emphasizing that, you need different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. You wouldn't use a screwdriver to hammer a nail, right? The guide walks through several key techniques. Let's start with one everyone probably knows, brainstorming.
Brainstorming, yeah. The source describes it as a face-to-face group method aiming to really maximize idea generation.
The core process is, well, first you define the problem clearly. Then you generate ideas freely, with a strict rule of no criticism initially. That's key. You record all ideas visually, maybe on a whiteboard, and only after the generation phase do you actually discuss and refine them.
That no criticism part is crucial for unleashing creativity, but wow, it's hard to stick to sometimes. What are its limitations, according to the source?
Well, groupthink is still a risk, even with brainstorming. Dominant personalities can sometimes overwhelm quieter ones, and its success often depends heavily on how skilled the facilitator is at managing the session and keeping things on track.
But for generating a high volume of ideas quickly, it's hard to beat. Like that marketing team brainstorming wild ideas for a viral campaign we mentioned.
Perfect use case. Now, if your primary concern is actually reducing that groupthink risk and ensuring everyone's voice is heard, the source presents the nominal group technique, or NGT.
AGT. This one sounds more structured. The text says it's a group method, but specifically designed to mitigate groupthink. How does that work?
The process is really key here. You clarify the issue first, but then individuals quietly and anonymously write down their ideas independently. Those ideas are collected and displayed anonymously, maybe on flip charts or digitally. This prompts a discussion where ideas are discussed based on their merit, but importantly, not attributed to specific individuals. Finally, members individually rank the ideas, and the group decision is based on the aggregated rankings.
Oh, okay. So your initial ideas are separate from the group discussion, and your final vote is independent. That definitely minimizes direct influence or pressure.
Right. It really levels the playing field, especially if there are power dynamics in the group. Limitations. Well, it can sometimes feel a bit impersonal or mechanical. It can take longer than open brainstorming, and maybe individual motivation to prepare might be lower since input is anonymous initially.
But the example of a hospital committee using NGT for patient care protocols makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Ensuring that nurses or junior doctors' vital insights aren't potentially overshadowed by senior staff.
Exactly. A technique chosen specifically to counter those potential hierarchy issues. Okay, another technique in the toolbox is the Delphi technique.
Delphi. This one sounds like it's for bigger, maybe more uncertain problems. The source calls it virtual and expert-based.
That's right. It's often used for complex or future-oriented issues where the needed expertise is distributed, maybe geographically or across different fields. A core team drafts questionnaires and sends them to a panel of external experts, usually anonymously. They analyze the responses, synthesize them, find common ground, points of disagreement,
And then,
and then they send revised questionnaires back to the same experts in iterative rounds, sharing the summarized results from the previous round, seeking convergence of opinions or at least clarification of different viewpoints.
so multiple rounds of anonymous expert forecasting and refinement until you get some kind of consensus or at least a clear picture of the expert
Yeah,
views.
the anonymity is key. It helps prevent any single expert from dominating the process just because of their reputation. And the iterative rounds allow the collective wisdom, hopefully, to converge. It's very useful when your required expertise is spread out all over the place.
But that sounds like it could take quite a bit of time dealing with multiple rounds and waiting for experts.
It is typically time intensive, yeah, due to the multiple rounds, and it relies heavily on the availability and continued commitment of those external experts. There's always the risk of expert fatigue, people dropping out.
The example given is a government agency forecasting the long-term impact of a future technology by consulting external academics and industry leaders. That fits the distributed expertise and future-oriented aspects perfectly.
Absolutely. Okay, shifting gears a bit to more quantitative tools, the source discusses game theory.
Game theory, okay, that sounds like chess or maybe economics. The source says it's analytical for competitive environments where your outcomes depend heavily on others' choices.
It is, very much so. You identify the players involved, your competitors, perhaps partners. You map out their possible strategies and your own. Then you model the potential payoffs, profits, market share, whatever the metric is for different combinations of strategies. Finally, you analyze this model to find likely equilibria or outcomes, which guides your own strategy choice while trying to anticipate your opponent's moves.
Like strategic maneuvering in a competitive landscape. Very calculating. The source mentions things like pricing competition between companies, negotiation tactics, even military strategy.
Exactly. Those are classic applications. The challenge, though, is that it requires pretty accurate data about your competitors' motivations, their capabilities, their potential strategies, which is often hard to get. The modeling itself can get very complex very quickly. And it often assumes a level of perfect rationality that, as we've discussed with Simon, is often bounded in the real world. People don't always act perfectly rationally.
That example of two airlines deciding on their pricing strategy, constantly anticipating how the other will react to avoid a ruinous price war. That's a classic illustration of game theory in action, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, another quantitative approach mentioned is operations research, or OR, and a specific type of it, linear programming, or LP.
Right. The source calls OR a quantitative scientific approach to problem solving, and LP a specific technique for linear optimization problems.
Basically, for OR, you define the problem mathematically. You quantify all the relevant variables, costs, resources, time, demand, whatever they are. You build a mathematical model that represents the problem and its constraints. And then you use computational techniques, things like simulations, optimization algorithms, spiralized solvers, to find optimal or near optimal solutions or recommendations. LP is just a subset focused specifically on optimizing linear relationships, like maximizing profit given linear costs and resource constraints.
So, using math and computers to solve complex resource allocation or logistics problems, things like that. What are the limitations here? Seems powerful, but maybe not always applicable.
Well, you definitely need specialists, people with expertise in OR, to build and interpret these models correctly. They are heavily reliant on the accuracy of your input data and the assumptions you make when building the model, garbage in, garbage out, as they say. And there's always a risk of over-relying on the model's output without applying necessary human judgment or considering important qualitative factors that the model couldn't capture.
The examples are spot on, though. A logistics company optimizing delivery routes to minimize cost using OR, that makes perfect sense. Or a factory deciding exactly how much of different products to manufacture given limited materials and machine time to maximize profit using LP. Very concrete applications for hard numbers.
Indeed. Now, for something completely different and much, much simpler, the ABC technique.
Ah, ABC prioritization. That feels familiar for just managing tasks day to day. The source says it's simple prioritization for when you have many tasks and limited time.
It's really straightforward. You just list your tasks, then
Yeah.
categorize them as A, critical, urgent, must do, B, important but not immediately critical, due soon, or C, less important, could maybe delegate or do later if time permits, and then you tackle them in that ABC order.
Super easy to grasp and apply, and it immediately ensures you're focusing on the most critical items first, especially when you're feeling under pressure.
Exactly. The main limitations, I suppose, are that it really oversimplifies dependencies between tasks. Maybe a B task is needed before an A task can be finished. And the categories themselves are pretty static. They might need reevaluating frequently.
But for someone like a manager prioritizing their daily to-do list, urgent client fire drills are A, preparing for a key team meeting is B, organizing old emails is probably C. It's incredibly practical for just cutting through the noise.
A great personal productivity tool drawn directly from decision-making principles.
Hmm.
Okay, finally, the source mentions one more group technique, consensus mapping.
Consensus mapping. This sounds like it's for getting very large groups on board with something. The text describes it for large groups using clusters to achieve broad consensus. How does that work?
It's quite involved. It typically involves dividing a large body, like, say, all the managers in a big company, into smaller clusters or working groups. A nodal or coordinating group clarifies the issue or question. Each cluster then proposes ideas or solutions. The nodal group compiles these into a kind of straw man proposal, trying to synthesize the input. And then there are iterative feedback loops between the nodal group and the clusters, refining, discussing, modifying, until hopefully a broad consensus emerges that most clusters can agree on.
Wow, that sounds like a significant investment of time and coordination effort.
It absolutely is. It's very time-consuming and coordination-intensive.
Yeah.
There's also the potential risk, if you're not careful, that the final outcome ends up being a kind of lowest common denominator agreement, something bland that everyone can live with but nobody's truly excited about, just to reach consensus.
But I can see its use. For something like a multinational corporation trying to set a global environmental policy where buy-in across very different regions and departments is absolutely crucial, it makes sense as a structured way to build that shared understanding and agreement, even if it takes time.
It's designed specifically for that kind of broad buy-in situation. And really, the source makes it clear that the key takeaway from all these techniques is that you need to match the technique to the specific situation you're facing. Brainstorming for generating raw ideas, NGT to reduce dominance and ensure equal voice, Delphi for expert future gazing, quantitative methods for measurable optimization problems, ABC for quick personal prioritization, consensus mapping for large group buy-in, and so on. There's no single best way.
That's a fantastic way to think about it, having a toolkit. It shifts you from thinking there's one right way to decide to recognizing you need the right approach for the right problem. Okay, and that brings us to the why. Why do decisions happen the way they do, especially in complex environments like organizations or governments? The source presents various models that offer different lenses on this.
Yeah, these models really help us understand the underlying forces at play. Who participates, how decisions actually emerge from all the interaction, and what dynamics might be shaping the outcome beyond just the formal steps or techniques we've discussed. They add layers of understanding.
We sort of started with the ideal rational model, full information, calculating the best outcome, optimizing. But the source pretty quickly contrasts that with reality, using Simon's idea of bounded rationality again.
Right. The rational model is a useful theoretical baseline, maybe what we aspire to. But bounded rationality acknowledges our real-world limits. Limited information, limited time, limited cognitive capacity, leading to satisficing, choosing good enough. Thinking back to that corporate strategic planning example, the company might try to be fully rational, gather all data, model everything. But ultimately, they'll likely choose a strategy that seems workable, meets key targets, and feels satisfactory based on achievable goals and available data, not necessarily the absolute theoretical peak performance plan that a computer might calculate.
It's the difference between theory and messy practice, really.
Yeah.
Then there are incremental models. The source talks about branching, disjointed, and logical incrementalism. What's the core idea there?
The core idea here is that decisions, especially in established organizations or government, often aren't big, sudden leaps or radical changes. Instead, they're frequently small, marginal adjustments to existing policies or practices over time. This can be driven by practicalities like sunk costs, we've already invested so much in this path, or political realities wanting to avoid major disruption. It's sometimes called muddling through.
Muddling through, yeah.
Now, disjointed incrementalism can look a bit chaotic, reactive, step by step, without a clear overarching plan. But logical incrementalism suggests these small steps can still be part of an intended, conscious, iterative path towards a larger strategic goal, learning and adapting along the way.
Like how government budgets often change incrementally year to year, tweaking things here and there, rather than having a complete philosophical overhaul every single time. It's less disruptive, maybe, but perhaps slower to affect big change if it's needed.
Precisely. A more chaotic-sounding model the source mentions is the garbage can model.
The garbage can. Okay, that sounds less like strategy and more like, well, chance or just randomness.
The source uses this model, maybe provocatively, to describe decision-making in what it calls organized anarchies. Think of some universities, or perhaps R&D labs, where goals can be ambiguous, participation is fluid, and the processes aren't always tightly defined. In this view, decisions are seen as almost accidental outcomes. They happen when separate, independent streams of problems looking for attention, potential solutions looking for problems, participants with time and energy, and choice opportunities like meetings happen to collide or connect simultaneously in the garbage can.
So it's not that someone deliberately decided, okay, we should solve this specific problem with that particular solution. It's more like, hey, here's a problem floating around. Look who happens to be in the room today. And someone just happened to mention this interesting idea. Okay, sounds good. Let's go with that. Kind of opportunistic.
Exactly. It's less about rational, linear choice and much more about timing, chance encounters, and the accidental conversions of the necessary elements in a somewhat unstructured or ambiguous setting. It highlights how context and timing can sometimes dictate outcomes almost randomly.
Fascinating, and maybe a bit unsettling if you like things neat and tidy. Okay, the source also delves into models that really focus on power and influence in shaping decisions. This seems crucial for understanding organizational or political decisions.
Absolutely. These models provide different lenses to see how who holds power or who can effectively influence the process often determines the outcome, regardless of the rational merits. The source outlines several distinct perspectives here. First, there are institutional models. These look at how decisions often follow the established jurisdiction, rules, and standard operating procedures of specific agencies or departments. If an issue doesn't fall neatly under a particular institution's official purview, it might simply not get decided, or get decided based on that institution's narrow mandate. Think of a regulatory agency only being able to set standards within its specific legal authority, even if a broader problem exists.
Okay, so structure and mandate dictate the decision space.
Then there are group models. These highlight how powerful outside groups, lobbies, interest groups, unions, can exert significant influence on decision makers, shaping policies to benefit their members. The classic example is farming lobbies influencing agricultural subsidy policies.
Right, external pressures.
Elite models take a slightly different, maybe more critical view. They suggest that, in some cases, decisions might effectively be made by a small, cohesive elite group. Maybe economic elites, political insiders primarily protecting their own interests, regardless of broader public need or input. Consider controversial examples like infrastructure contracts, potentially favoring politically connected firms.
A more concentrated view of power.
And then there's the pluralist model. This sees decision-making, particularly in democratic governments, as a dynamic competition between numerous diverse groups with different interests. The state acts somewhat like a referee, mediating the conflict, and the final policy outcome is often a compromise reflecting the relative influence, resources, and bargaining power of those competing groups.
So policy emerges from the push and pull of different interest groups battling it out.
Exactly. And the source notes that a refinement, neopluralism, adds the insight that state actors themselves, agencies, politicians, can also be seen as competing groups with their own interests, not just neutral referees.
That pluralist view, where policy emerges from negotiation and compromise between different interests, seems very applicable to complex areas like environmental regulations or labor laws, where you have industry, activists, unions, all pushing different ways. It sounds like the source is careful here to just report on these models as analytical tools, right? Without endorsing any specific one or taking political sides.
Absolutely. The text presents these as different frameworks for understanding how power dynamics can shape decisions in complex systems. They offer different potential explanations for why certain outcomes occur, particularly in governmental or large organizational contexts, helping you analyze situations from various angles. They aren't presented as definitive statements of how things always work, but as useful lenses.
Got it. And there are also models looking specifically at incentives and governance structures too, right?
Yes, moving beyond just power dynamics to the rules and motivations. Principal-agent theory is a big one here. It analyzes decisions based on the relationship and often the conflicting interests between a principal, like citizens represented by politicians or a company's shareholders, and an agent they delegate tasks to, like a government bureaucrat or a CEO, or even a private firm contracted to do public work. It explores common issues, like the agent potentially pursuing their own self-interest, the principal having less information than the agent, information asymmetry, and the costs involved in the principal monitoring the agent to ensure they act in the principal's best interest.
Like a city council, the principal, outsourcing waste management to a private company, the agent. The city needs detailed contracts and ongoing monitoring to make sure the company actually serves the public good effectively and doesn't just cut corners to maximize their own profit at the public's expense.
It's exactly that kind of relationship. Then there's public choice theory. This essentially takes an economic lens and applies it directly to political behavior. It views political actors, voters, politicians, bureaucrats, interest groups as primarily motivated by rational self-interest, much like economic agents are assumed to be in a market. This model is often used to explain potential government failures or inefficiencies, like bureaucratic agencies perhaps lobbying for larger budgets to increase their own power or prestige, regardless of the actual public need for their services.
So, seeing political and bureaucratic behavior through the cold logic of self-interest and incentives, interesting. And the final model mentioned in this section.
That was New Public Management, or NPM. This is maybe less a descriptive theory of how decisions naturally emerge, and more a prescriptive approach aimed at improving public sector decision-making and performance. It involves applying business-like principles and techniques in the public sector, things like focusing strongly on measurable results and outcomes, using performance metrics, giving public managers more autonomy and flexibility in how they achieve goals, and sometimes introducing competition among service providers, even within the public sector.
So, trying to make government more efficient and results-oriented, like a business. An example might be public hospitals being given specific vaccination targets and their managers having flexibility on how to best meet them, using efficiency criteria rather than just following rigid procedures.
Exactly. It represents a shift towards managing for results. So you can see there's a whole array of different lenses, from rationality limits to incrementalism to chance, power dynamics, and incentive structures that help us understand the complex forces that influence how decisions ultimately play out in the real world. It's clearly not just one simple, linear process. They each offer a valuable perspective, highlighting different facets of complex decision-making systems.
And this guide also throws in some really interesting glimpses from history and earlier thinkers, which I found fascinating. It shows people have been grappling with these ideas about good decision-making for a very, very long time.
Yes, it's definitely not a purely modern concern. The source mentions Kautilya, for instance, from ancient India, who advised rulers in the Arthashastra. He emphasized the value of group decision-making, famously using the analogy, "one wheel alone does not turn." He also stressed the importance of timeliness, warning that an affair postponed becomes difficult or even impossible to settle, still relevant today.
One wheel alone does not turn. Such a simple but powerful image for collaboration, isn't it? What about Mary Parker Follett? She was mentioned too.
Yes, Follett, an early 20th century management thinker, way ahead of her time, she had some brilliant insights. One was her concept of the law of the situation. She argued that orders or decisions should ideally flow naturally from the objective needs and facts of the situation itself, rather than simply from hierarchical authority because I'm the boss isn't the best reason. She also focused heavily on integration in conflict resolution, trying to find a creative, third way that synthesizes the underlying desires of both parties rather than just compromise, where both sides have to give something up.
The law of the situation that really shifts the focus from who's in charge to what does the reality of the situation demand, that feels quite profound. And Chester Barnard, another early name mentioned.
Barnard, yes, a former executive himself who wrote about the functions of the executive in organizations. He highlighted something quite interesting. The significant executive decision not to decide. Recognizing when a matter is premature, irrelevant, or when taking action would be unwise, and consciously choosing not to make a decision at that time. He also introduced the concept of the zone of indifference, the range of orders or requests within which employees will accept authority without consciously questioning it. Understanding this zone is crucial for knowing how decisions will likely be received and implemented.
That decision not to decide feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? When we're often just overwhelmed with information and demands for immediate choices. Sometimes waiting, gathering more info, or even letting something go intentionally is the most effective choice.
It requires real judgment to know when inaction is the right action.
Okay, so we've covered the fundamental steps. We've explored a diverse toolbox of techniques. We've looked at different models explaining the underlying dynamics and the why, and we've even touched on some historical wisdom. Now, how does the source synthesize all this into practical advice? For you, the listener, to actually make better decisions yourself.
Yeah, the text pulls together several key best practices based on everything discussed. First, and maybe most importantly, it stresses the need to accurately diagnose the situation and its urgency right at the start. That initial step informs everything else. Do you need speed? Do you need broad buy-in? How complex is it? That helps you choose between individual or group methods and which specific techniques might fit.
So really understand the context before you even start thinking about solutions.
Exactly. Second, always try to use the appropriate technique. Don't try to force brainstorming onto a problem that really needs rigorous quantitative analysis. Or use a simple ABC method for a complex, multi-stakeholder strategic issue. Match the tool to the job from that toolbox we discussed.
That toolbox isn't just for show. Use it wisely.
Right. Third, consciously embed feedback loops. Just like Simon's model showed, planning for monitoring and evaluation after implementation is absolutely critical for learning and adapting. Don't just make a decision and walk away assuming it worked.
You need to measure whether it actually achieved what you intended.
Fourth, always acknowledge bounded rationality. Be realistic about your own limits and the limits of your information. Aim to set clear thresholds for what a successful, satisfactory outcome looks like, rather than getting paralyzed chasing an often impossible perfect optimum.
Give yourself permission, maybe, to be good enough sometimes.
Fifth, try to balance quantitative and qualitative information. Don't just rely solely on the numbers from models or data analysis. Incorporate human judgment, experience, intuition, and contextual understanding. Data provides crucial insights, but it doesn't always tell the whole story or capture everything important.
Data informs, it doesn't dictate the final choice.
Sixth, actively work to mitigate known biases. We all have them. Use techniques like anonymity where appropriate, like in NGT or Delphi. Ensure you have diverse perspectives and backgrounds on your team if possible, and employ structured decision processes to counteract common pitfalls like groupthink or confirmation bias.
So, design your decision-making process to fight against those natural human tendencies.
Seventh, ensure timeliness. Avoid analysis paralysis, getting stuck endlessly gathering more data. Remember Kautilya. Sometimes making a provisional or incremental decision using a simpler method now is better than waiting indefinitely for a perfect information that may never arrive.
Don't let the search for the absolute perfect decision prevent a necessary or timely one.
Eighth, facilitate participation when it's needed, especially for complex decisions with broad impact. Involve relevant stakeholders early, especially those who will be affected by the decision or whose cooperation is needed for successful implementation. This builds understanding and buy-in.
Get the right people involved appropriately.
Ninth, be explicit about your underlying assumptions and premises. What facts are you taking as given? What values or priorities are guiding your choice between options? Clarifying these upfront helps others understand the rationale behind the decision and helps you review it more effectively later on.
Laying the groundwork clearly, making the reasoning transparent.
10th, leverage technology appropriately. Use data analytics tools, simulation software, collaborative platforms. They are incredibly powerful enablers for modern decision-making. But always remember they are tools. Understand their limitations, question their outputs, and don't let them become a black box where you don't understand how the recommendation was generated.
Use the tech, but stay firmly in charge of the critical thinking.
And finally, make reflection a regular habit. Conduct postmortems or after-action reviews on significant decisions critically, whether they were perceived as successful or unsuccessful, to capture lessons learned about both the outcome and the process used. Then feed those lessons back into improving your future decision-making approach itself.
So it's not just about making a single good decision, but about continuously getting better at how you make decisions over time.
Exactly. The source also briefly touches on maintaining ethical values throughout the process
Yeah.
and the need to adapt approaches to different cultural contexts, just reminding us that it's ultimately a deeply human process, not just a technical one.
Wow. Okay, we've really done a deep dive into this source material, haven't we? We started with those basic steps Herbert Simon laid out, explored that whole arsenal of techniques for tackling different kinds of problems, from brainstorming to complex modeling, and then examined all those various models that help us understand why decisions happen the way they do in the complex reality of organizations and governments. Everything from the ideal rational world to surprising concepts like the garbage can.
And we layered in some timeless wisdom from earlier thinkers and hopefully some really practical best practices drawn from all of it. Understanding these concepts, I think, gives you a much more powerful framework, whether you're navigating a tough personal choice, leading a team towards a goal, or just trying to make sense of a major policy decision you read about. This deep dive provides the vocabulary and the insight to approach it more thoughtfully and effectively.
It really does. It connects the sort of academic ideas to real-world action. And thinking about Simon's fundamental insight, that idea of bounded rationality, the fact that achieving the perfect, optimal decision is often simply impossible for us mere mortals.
Hmm.
Here's a final thought for you to maybe mull over as you go about your day. If success in decision-making isn't necessarily always about achieving the absolute best possible outcome, what does success truly look like in the real world? And how does acknowledging our limitations maybe shift our focus from just judging the final result to also evaluating the quality, the thoughtfulness, and the learning embedded in the process we used to get there?
That's a great question. Something to definitely consider the next time you face a choice, big or small.